After finally getting around to playing the original Psychonauts, it really blew me away. The gameplay was nothing more than just above perfectly average, but the writing was absolutely phenomenal. The iconic levels, locations, characters, and moments made it obvious why it became such an instant classic in 2005 and continues to reach new fans to this day. I quickly became a huge fan of the original game, and in the span of just a few weeks after I first played it, I had replayed it through the Steam release, watched any and all extra content on it that I could find, and made a review on it. Literally the same moment that I clicked upload on that review, I booted up Psychonauts 2 for the first time. I'll always distinctly remember the feelings rushing through my head during my first few minutes with the game. I was unbelievably excited just coming off of editing my previous review, but at the same time, I was nervous. The love that I hold for the original Psychonauts is such a unique one. The defining aspects there are so bold and unlike anything I'd ever seen before that I wasn't certain anything else could capture that. Thankfully, it took practically no time at all before my slight concerns were put to rest. Having finished the game now, I can confidently say that not only does it live up to the nearly impossible expectations set by its predecessor, but it succeeds them. This game is everything I wanted it to be and more. Not only is Psychonauts 2 just as good as the original, it's even better. It's probably best to get the most obvious distinction from the first game out of the way. This game was released in 2021, 16 whole years after the original. Like I mentioned in my review of the first game, it was a complete dud on release, and while it wasn't disastrous enough to force Double Fine out of the industry, it practically ensured that a sequel was not coming anytime soon. It didn't begin to pick up steam until Double Fine got the publishing rights years later. Psychonauts is a game that pretty much demands a sequel. As well realized as the concept of entering minds is, it feels like there's so much unexplored ground to cover. There are so many more potential abilities and ideas for minds, and while the original game doesn't feel unfinished by any stretch of the imagination, it does leave you wanting more. It also ends on a cliffhanger, not really a huge one, but one that just lets you know there are more stories to tell with the world. It's pretty similar to the end of The Incredibles, which, ironically enough, also took way too long to get a sequel. Anyway, with the increased popularity in the game, the demand for a sequel finally began to rise as well. Only problem was, no studio seemed able to give it a chance. It's not really hard to see why. I mean, it's a bizarre concept in the first place, and when you consider that the first game bombed upon release, it really just seems like a recipe for disaster from the business side of things. However, with the modern age in mind, Double Fine turned to crowdfunding to let this project become a reality. After a successful campaign on the platform Fig, Psychonauts 2 was set with the money it needed to become a reality. Unfortunately, this isn't the end of the story, as even with generous fan support, finances still weren't sufficient enough. Delays were frequent, and the game was looking to be stuck in development hell from the outside, fated to be one of those long-awaited revivals that just never caught on in the way that it should have. This is where, surprisingly enough, Microsoft of all companies jumped in to save the day. Double Fine Productions joined Xbox Game Studios in 2019 and were given essentially complete freedom in terms of deadlines, budget, and creativity. Ironically enough, the same company that dropped the original game nearly 2 decades ago is the primary reason that the sequel even saw the light of day in the first place. And that brings us to 2021, where Psychonauts 2 is finally here. The game starts off with this awesome recap that will make any fan of the original smile, and not long after that you're thrusted right into the action. And I mean right into the action. This game barely takes any time to get going at all. The first game had a bit of a slower start, having you introduce yourself at summer camp and walk around a little bit before you got to the first level, and even then it takes a few tutorial stages before the story actually begins to take shape, but by contrast, the tutorial level in Psychonauts 2 begins with you in the middle of a mission inside the mind of Dr. Lobato, one of the main antagonists from the first game. I love how quickly this stage begins to unravel. It starts out with the Psychonauts playing mental tricks on Lobato, but things quickly take a turn for the worst once he realizes what's happening, and the level begins to lose its structure. It's a bombastic way to get the game started and paces out the tutorials really well. The original game pretty much stopped the game to teach you how a new ability worked every time you unlocked one, and even then that process was dragged out across multiple levels. But here, you get 4 basic abilities one after another all within the opening level, and that level is carefully designed to get you accustomed to them without halting the game to slowly explain how they work. The reason that we're messing around in Lobato's mind in the first place is because he was up to a few things in between games. If you haven't played the first game, the cliffhanger ending there was that Truman Zanotto, grand head of the Psychonauts, had been kidnapped. While they quickly discovered that Lobato was the one who did it, they just as quickly discovered that he was just a puppet being used by some higher power, and the whole purpose of this opening level is to investigate his mind and find out who he's working for. Inside his mind, Raz discovers that whoever it was had psychologically trained Lobato not to let his employer's identity through no matter what, and that he's being kept under control by the threat of some mysterious force called Molecula. This whole experience also brings to light that whoever had access to Zanotto in the first place must have been a mole in the Psychonauts. And with that, the story's main goal is already clear and you're headed off to get to work on unraveling the mystery. Who is the mole? What is Molecula? How is Zanotto involved? All of these questions paved the way for a significantly more involved story than the first game. I mentioned last time how I felt like the story in the original wasn't very engaging and was pretty much just a vehicle to get to the interesting minds. I still feel this way, and I still maintain that this isn't a problem. It's almost like a TV show, with each mind being a different episode. They're all really entertaining, but they're definitely meant to be taken on their own. However, the story in Psychonauts 2 is genuinely really good. The game is still new, so I'll try my best not to spoil anything, but this game tells a much more connected story than the original. Every mind is directly intertwined with the narrative, and outside of the minds, the plot is always moving, taking you to new locations and providing memorable moments and twists. There's a very strong emotional core this time around, as the story primarily revolves around the themes of loss, self-worth, and consequence. This is only furthered by the fact that all of the minds you explore belong to the main characters. Before, they were just one-offs that weren't really seen again after you finished your business and moved on, but here all of the characters that you explore the psyche of are the key players in the story. This sounds like it could get pretty heavy, and it does get there at points. Many points in the story are downright sad, especially in the second half, and are given many more opportunities to flourish than before. Psychonauts 2 definitely takes its story much more seriously than the original. Yet, the game maintains an optimistic tone throughout. They put it best in this disclaimer card that you get when you open the game for the first time. Psychonauts 2 is a game about healing. You're presented with a group of characters that have been through pretty much the worst things you can imagine. Raz is presented with lives and minds that are quite literally tattered, but he's able to help them all reconcile. There are genuinely powerful scenes here, and having such a profound story really helped me to fall into the world here, even more than I did with the first game. Speaking of the characters, I honestly think the cast is better this time around as well. You mainly focus on the Psychic Six here, a group that was mentioned in the original but was never really expanded upon until now. They were all mentally scarred in some significant way during a major event years ago, and since then, they've pretty much all lost themselves. Everybody's story connects with each other, and there are some really fantastic details referring to certain characters that will pop up in other characters' minds. Some you won't even notice until much later. Everything is given a lot more depth in general, and the game does an incredible job of delicately portraying serious mental issues. All of the characters' stories are still supported by the levels themselves, and the attention to detail here is just as good as it was before. From the visual design to the hidden vaults to the frequent metaphors throughout, nearly every aspect of design serves to deepen and enhance each character, in addition to simply making the levels better. This was an area where the original Psychonauts excelled, and the sequel doesn't slack behind at all. Raz's role here is a lot more serious than in the first game, because with more realized and intricate trauma, he can't go around carelessly like he could before. After Raz makes a massive mistake early on in the game, there is a clear shift in how he approaches every character's consciousness. He treads more delicately, always asking consent before delving into minds, never directly meddling with issues, but giving people the tools to overcome their issues on their own. It's a very natural evolution of his character, and I was really happy with the way he was portrayed here coming off of the first game. I realize that the way I'm describing it makes it seem like this game is far more serious than its lighthearted predecessor, and while that is the case, that's not to say that this game is grim all the time. No, far from it. The whole game maintains a fun and lighthearted energy despite the serious subject matter, but also knows when to pump the brakes and have more down-to-earth moments. It's a good tonal mix that never feels confused. While I adore how the main characters are handled here, the side characters, on the other hand, aren't quite as good as the original in my opinion. They're still fine, and I appreciate the attempt to have a notably different cast in the original so they weren't just doing the same thing over again, but I never found any of these guys nearly as memorable as the kids in the first game. They're not bad or anything, and I do like how they're more actively involved with the action at points, but they don't feel quite as original or entertaining as before. One thing that I really appreciate about the story is the way that it offers a much wider look into the world that was established in the first game. There, it was a very concentrated focus on a summer camp and an asylum, and that's about it. There were hints dropped of greater things outside, but it was mainly just flavor text. Here, we finally get to see Psychonauts in action. I already mentioned how the game starts out with what's essentially a spy mission, but that continues all throughout. We get to see high authority figures, headquarters, operations, and it's all so refreshing. It's a really great and natural expansion off of what the first game offered and hinted at. If there's one area where Psychonauts 2 is a downgrade from the original, it's the humor. I praised the original for being hilarious throughout, but unfortunately Psychonauts 2 just isn't. It's still funny at points, it got laughs out of me, but nothing here is anywhere near as strong as the highlights from the first game. I'm pretty sure this is mostly because Eric Wolpaw is noticeably absent from the project, with Tim Schafer taking the full writing credit this time around. This is the only area of the game that I can call a disappointment. The first game was so funny and this one just isn't anywhere near that same level. That's not to say there's no good material here, but it isn't anywhere near what I would have expected from a Psychonauts sequel. Still, when every other aspect is so good, it's hard to care about some of the humor not landing. The writing in Psychonauts was some of the best I had ever seen in a game, and Psychonauts 2 continues to push the bar even further. I noted how I loved the visual style of the first game, and I'm happy to say that the second game is just as good in this department. Obviously, there's been a huge upgrade in graphical quality. Everything is so much cleaner now, expectedly so since it's been 16 years since last time. The core of the visual design is kept intact and is only improved upon here. The colors are definitely brighter overall, and some of the new characters seem more original and less Tim Burton. But if anything, I just see this as Psychonauts becoming more comfortable with its own style. It feels more original and less derivative, while still remaining recognizable. Psychonauts 2 looks absolutely incredible, and seeing everything from the first game realized in a new updated light is such a fun experience for fans of the original. In my review of the original Psychonauts, I said that while the writing in that game was nothing short of incredible, the gameplay was fairly generic. Not bad and enough to be fun, but not especially good. This is why I'm so happy to say that Psychonauts 2 is a much more fun game to play. Not only are the writing and presentation improved upon here, but the gameplay gets a massive jump in quality. Firstly, the controls are way tighter this time around. I really like how Raz controls in the original, but he's very floaty there. And while I don't have any problems with that control scheme, I would be lying if I didn't admit that 2's is so much better. Raz feels much more precise this time around. Every aspect of movement from acceleration to momentum feels completely under your control. There were never any times Raz didn't behave exactly like I wanted him to, and while it was slightly jarring coming from the first game, I quickly got a hang of it and began to prefer it. Just like in the last game, the things that really make Psychonauts so fun to play are Raz's psychic abilities. While there are some new abilities, most are returning from the first game, but they all behave differently. For example, with telekinesis in the first game, you had to awkwardly stop and aim an arc for whatever you wanted to throw, which made it kinda cumbersome to use, especially in combat. Here, not only can you use it while moving, but you don't have to aim an arc anymore. It's just like firing a normal projectile at a target now, much easier and more fun to use. The only move that really got a downgrade was Levitation, which got nerfed pretty severely. Gliding now has a cooldown where it didn't before, and you can't reach nearly the same heights or speeds that you could before. Levitation was my favorite move in the original game, so it's unfortunate to see it handled this way, but I completely understand why. As much as I loved Levitation, it could easily trivialize the majority of platforming challenges in the original game. This is really just ensuring that the pace of the levels is more controlled, which I'm totally okay with. It's not like it's worthless now either, no. It still adds a ton of variety and options to maneuverability. There's a lot of subtle changes to the way the game works as well, which aren't exactly game changers, but all add up to a pretty substantial mechanical upgrade. For one thing, the lock-on is now handled by clicking the right stick, which frees up the left trigger to be able to assign another psychic ability. There's a dedicated dodge button now, and you can use that in midair for a new dive move. You can wall jump this time as well. These make controlling Raz feel even better than it already did, with way more options for how you can string moves together. Nothing huge, but when all of these things are put together, there's a lot of really good small improvements. I neglected to mention the combat in the last review because, to be completely honest, I barely noticed it. It's completely optional most of the time, and in the rare occasion where you do have to face enemies, it's never anything more than spamming Side Blast and dodging until you can move on. Psychonauts 2 provides a massive upgrade in this area, not only making combat a more significant part of the game, but managing to have it perfectly integrate every single one of Raz's abilities. A lot of the reason the combat is so much better this time around is just because, like I already mentioned, Raz feels way better to control. However, the new enemy design really does wonders for the encounters as well. Of course, there are still the sensors from the first game, but there are tons of new enemies based on bad mental habits. There's regrets, doubts, judges, bad moods, and more, and all of them combine to ensure that every single psychic ability is being used in a creative way. The scope of Psychonauts 2 is far greater than the first game. What I mean by this is that the environments you'll be exploring this time around are significantly bigger. In the first game, you had the camp and the asylum as the hub worlds, and while they were totally serviceable, they pale in comparison to what this game has. There are 4 different hub areas here, each of them much bigger than anything the first game had. Not only are they large, but they're dense, packed with dozens of collectibles and secret areas that are super fun to seek out. I found myself losing track of time often exploring these because they really just are that fun to run around in. In addition to the hub worlds, the mines you explore have an even bigger upgrade in size. These things are huge this time around. They take much longer than in the first game, but that's not due to padding. The level design here is absolutely fantastic. That combined with the incredibly thoughtful writing just makes sure that every single level here has every last drop of potential squeezed out of it. Just take Bob's Bottles for example. You've got a string of islands to explore, a greenhouse section, an overgrown version of Psychonauts headquarters, and a grand wedding ceremony, all in the same level. It's all consistent within the narrative too. Not one of these sections of the level feels out of place. Not to mention how every area is strung together with these impossible 3D spaces. It's such a cool experience. These levels are nothing short of phenomenal, and some of the best designed levels I've ever seen in any game. I can't even choose a favorite level here because every single one of them is just so well thought out and realized. It is seriously remarkable how there isn't a single dud here. I mentioned last time how Psychonauts solved the common problem of having worthless collectibles, and Psychonauts 2 manages to improve that formula even further. The first game did it through a ranking system which would gradually upgrade your moveset as you leveled up, in addition to having vaults and hidden lore scattered throughout the level. This game keeps the vaults and lore-based rewards, but reworks the ranking system to be far more rewarding. In the first game, rewards were predetermined based on what rank you were at, but here, each rank up gives you 1 upgrade point which you can choose to spend however you wish. This is great. It lets you take control over what you think sounds the most fun at the time and makes it more exciting when you rank up. There's no longer the feeling of hoping you get something good this time. It's a feeling of excitement that you can finally get that special upgrade you've had your eye on. I've described almost every aspect of Psychonauts 2 as an upgrade over the original, and I really think that's the best way to describe the game as a whole. It's a massive improvement over the original, which I already loved. The game is now a ton of fun to play, the writing is even better than before, the presentation is modernized without losing any of the charm of the original, and almost everything on display here is just better. This game is able to capture the heart of Psychonauts while leaving the dated aspects behind. It may not be as funny, but when everything else is just this good, that is so easy to ignore. Psychonauts 2 is one of the most consistently creative games out there. There is never a dull moment. I love everything about this game, from the characters that are hard to dislike, to the fantastic stages that still make me excited just thinking about them, to the story that genuinely surprised me with how engaging and heartfelt it was. There is not a single weak aspect to this game. Throughout Psychonauts, I got the feeling that it was developed by a team of underdogs who knew they had something special and would make it see the light of day no matter the cost. And they did exactly that, and it was great. Throughout Psychonauts 2, I got the feeling that the same team, now much more experienced, were finally getting a second chance with all the materials in the world at their hands to turn that idea into what it was always meant to be. Psychonauts 2 is a triumph in every sense of the word. It's great if you never played the original, but if you did, it'll be even better. This was such an amazing experience from start to finish, and I'm so happy with how this was handled. This is one of the best platformers ever made, and something that I will quickly recommend to any fan of the genre. If you skip out on this game, you are missing something truly special.